Okay, hello everyone, and today I'm going to talk about storytelling in video games and what makes it unique compared to storytelling in other media. So before I start off, I just want to say that you can interrupt me at any time if you have any questions or if you want to say any examples that you're thinking of things or concepts that I'm talking about, or for any other reason. And also let me know if you can't understand what I'm saying. Okay, so this is going to be the outline of my talk. First, I'm going to talk about the development of video game storytelling, how it started off, and how it evolved in a very basic way, not a very complex discussion. After that, I'm going to use that development to talk about player immersion, which I've divided into two categories that I made up. These aren't official terms or anything. Presentational immersion, which is how the game presents itself to the player, and interpersonal immersion, which is how the game connects with the player and how it reaches out to the player. And finally, I'm going to use that immersion to discuss the idea of player input and player output, what a player puts into a game and what a player gets out of a game. So overall, I'm going to talk about the what, the how, and the why of storytelling in video games. And while I do this, there are some questions that I thought would be helpful to think about. These aren't questions that I'll necessarily answer, but I'm going to try to, and they're important to think about anyway, I think. So I'll just read them off. To what extent are storytelling and interactivity at odds with each other, and to what extent are they not? What does storytelling contribute to a game? What effects do these contributions have, and what forms can they take? To what extent can video game storytelling be judged objectively? To what extent does its effect vary depending on the individual player? And most importantly, this is the general idea of this talk, how can video games make use of their unique medium to tell compelling and meaningful stories? And while I talked about the questions I'm going to be trying to answer, I also want to talk about the things I won't be trying to answer. And first off, I'm not going to be discussing what makes for good writing in a video game, because what I'm talking about here is storytelling unique to video games, whereas writing in general, for the most part, use the same principles no matter whether you're writing a book or a movie or a video game or anything else. So that's too general for this talk, and I won't be discussing it. And on that note, I also want to point out the difference between storytelling versus story and the way that I'll be using it. When I say storytelling, I don't necessarily mean some super long, complex JRPG or something. I'll use that definition sometimes, but not all the time. More usually, I just mean how any game communicates its ideas about the story, characters, and world to the player, and how the player receives those ideas. So a Mario game can have storytelling, like a Mario platformer. It doesn't need to be an RPG or anything. Any game can have storytelling to an extent. Whereas a story itself is usually more complicated. And then also on that note, I'm not going to be talking about how to develop better video games. I'm not going to be giving advice or anything like that because I'm not qualified to do that. I'm just going to be talking about the things that I've noticed that make storytelling in video games effective. And related to that, I'm not giving out any sort of objective information. None of what I'm going to say is fact. It's just what I've noticed. It's the way I see it. And any of you are free to disagree with it. And definitely let me know if you have any points you want to talk about that contradict mine. with all that over with, let's start. Wait, never mind. Let's not start. I'm going to be talking about storytelling video games, which means I'm going to be talking about video games, which means I might possibly be talking about spoilers, but I did try to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. I don't think there's any reason to worry about spoilers. Most of the games here are old anyway, but it's better to be safe than sorry, so I'm just putting this up front. If there's anything you don't want to see or hear, just stop listening to the video for a while. Okay, so starting off with the development of video game storytelling, and when we're talking about this, I think it's a good idea to start near the beginning of video games, and well, I'll do that in a second, sorry. But first, let's start even farther back and just talk about what video games are. And fundamentally, video games are a combination of different forms of media, which are visual art, sprites, models, etc., music and sound effects, and writing, along with some others, probably. But video games aren't just those three. They're more than that because they have a fourth element, which is interactivity. And that's the main thing that makes video games unique and basis of everything I'm going to be talking about today. So video games, for as long as they've existed, have had interactivity. If we start back with Pong in 1972, there are two players. Each controls a paddle. There's a ball that goes across the screen. You move the paddles. Moving the paddles is interactivity, and the goal is intuitive. You try to make sure your opponent does not catch the ball. It's a lot like tennis, actually. And as a result, since it's similar to something in everyday life, you don't really need any explanation for it. It's just really simple. It's really intuitive. And even with the interactivity, it's not hard to understand. It's just like a sport. So going a little farther in time, we have PAC-MAN, 1980. This is also pretty simple to understand, I think. There are a lot of characters here. There are things you have to get used to, but fundamentally, this is just a maze and collecting food. I think all the time we see things, puzzles that are like rats or mice going through mazes and collecting cheese. And this is no different. PAC-MAN is just going through these mazes, collecting pellets, avoiding the ghosts that are trying to eat him. And in that way, this is also pretty intuitive. The goal is to eat other things without being eaten, and that's a fact of natural life. So PAC-MAN and Pong are both pretty intuitive. They don't need any explanation. You don't need to know why they're happening, but this, okay, what is this? You have someone on screen, and you have mushrooms, and you have blocks and question marks, and there's no clear objective here. It's honestly pretty confusing if you've never seen it before, even though I'm sure everyone here has. And that's the point I want to make here. There's no intuitive goal. Looking at it now from the perspective of the present, it is intuitive. We all know that you go right and get to the goal, but that's not something you can easily get by looking at the screen. You don't know who the mushrooms are. You don't know that they're going to hurt you. You don't know that the other mushrooms are power-ups. You don't know what the blocks or question marks do. And that's why Super Mario Bros. Was one of the first games to introduce the idea of storytelling. It's a really limited form here. I think it was only in the manual, but you do get a story, which is that Bowser has kidnapped Princess Toadstool, and he cursed all the people in the Mushroom Kingdom to turn into blocks. And that's why Mario is going right. He's trying to defeat these enemies, and all these blocks you see are actually toads who've been cursed. And that's fundamentally what the story does. It provides context when you can't easily discern it otherwise, and it also provides purpose for playing. You're not just going through a random set of pixels, you're going to the right so that you can eventually rescue the princess. And as far as I know, that was pretty innovative at the time, and that's the role that storytelling plays. And storytelling only evolved over time as technology evolved. Even on the NES, storytelling evolved a lot as games were optimized. So in Mother 1 in 1989, well, this is an RPG with a huge open world. There are NPCs to talk to. And your goal isn't just going right, it's going around the world and collecting the 8 melodies so that you can defeat the final boss. This is something you absolutely would not know how to do without a story. The story provides context here, and it also provides a purpose. The storytelling here is the entire purpose that you're traveling around the world. Without that storytelling, you wouldn't have any purpose, and there wouldn't be any context, and there wouldn't be any game. So moving on, as technology evolved, storytelling continued to evolve. So this is Chrono Trigger. It's an amazing game, by the way. Definitely play it if you haven't. And here, this is the scene on a bridge where there's a battle. And this is interesting because there's context for the story as a whole, but there's also context for individual parts of the story. That is, this is a bridge. A bridge is a natural place for battle to take place. And so this explains why there's a boss battle here. Not right at this moment of the screenshot, but there is later on. So storytelling can dictate the entire game and parts of a game, and it can provide the purpose for the entire game or a purpose for part of the game. And jumping way forward, close to the present, I just chose Astral Chain randomly, but it's also amazing. We have these video games that are like very complex. They look comparable to movies with their cutscenes. Whereas Chrono Trigger had more playable cutscenes, like set pieces that resemble cutscenes, but they're just going through dialogue. More modern games have actual cutscenes that are reminiscent of movies. And so storytelling has evolved in its forms and purpose as technology evolved, but it always serves the same fundamental purpose of providing context and significance and purpose for a game. But at the same time as all of this, it's not really a uniform growth in one direction. For example, New Super Mario Bros. 2006, whereas the original was in 1985. This is a lot later, but it looks so similar, doesn't it? There are some things different, like the Mega Mushroom here wasn't in the original, but there are the Koopas, there are the question marks, the blocks, the same premise, basically the same thing as the original, just updated graphics. And that's because that's all it needs. Storytelling isn't always required to a great extent. Right here, the fundamental part of a Mario game is gameplay, and the storytelling just serves to contextualize it. So although this is a lot later than 1985, the storytelling doesn't need to be much more advanced than it was in 1985 because it serves its purpose. Likewise, Mega Man 11, which was really a comeback of the classic Mega Man series after a long hiatus. This is the intro cutscene, and there's Dr. Wily here, and that's a huge surprise, except it isn't a surprise at all, because there are around 17 or 18 classic Mega Man games, I think, and there are only 2 of those where Wily isn't the villain. So if you've played a Mega Man game before, you know Wily's always going to be behind, you know Wily's always going to be the villain, more or less. And this is basically the same plot as it was in Mega Man 1. Whereas in Mega Man 1, the plot was in the manual, here it's in an intro cutscene, but it's fundamentally the same, which is that Wily steals Dr. Light's robots and reprograms them to take over the world, and then Mega Man has to stop them. And that's all it needs. The fundamental part of Mega Man games is their gameplay, and the storytelling contextualizes it and provides a purpose for it. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this before. It's an app called Flow Free. It's a puzzle game that I used to play for hours. But this is something I thought would also be interesting to bring up, because a lot of games don't have any storytelling whatsoever, like this. Here you just connect the same colored dots to each other by a line, and the goal is that you have to connect them all without having any of the lines overlap. And there's no storytelling here whatsoever. No explanation of why you're doing this, for what purpose you're doing it, but you don't need storytelling. You don't need a purpose because it's intuitive. They're the same colored dots. It's intuitive to connect them with each other. So there's some games that don't need a storytelling. And I'm probably going to date this talk when I say this, but Among Us is very popular right now. I haven't played it myself yet, but I do know the premise, which is that there are astronauts on the space station. And as far as I know, I've asked a few people, that's all there is. And that's all there needs to be as well. This is an example of a small extent of storytelling. There is storytelling. There's the context of being on the space station and doing different tasks and finding out who the imposter is. But you don't know why the imposter is there, as far as I know, or anything along those lines. So different games require different extents of storytelling depending on how much context they need. So in summary, storytelling in video games fundamentally serves to provide context. Over time, as technology evolved, that purpose evolved too. Storytelling conveyed literary themes and ideas and emotions and all of that. But fundamentally, storytelling always has the same purpose, which is to give the player significance in playing the game. They aren't just moving through a set of pixels, they're moving through a world. They have purpose to keep playing the game. They know the outcome of their actions. And different games require storytelling to different extents, like all those examples I showed. But with all this in mind, the thing I want to highlight is that context from storytelling leads to purpose and significance, and that purpose and significance is what can get a player immersed in a game. The purpose and significance combines with the interactivity that video games have, and that's what creates player immersion, which I want to talk about in the next section, now that I've established, hopefully, how it can come about. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, if you have questions, you can interrupt me at any time. So we covered the basic development of video game storytelling. So now I want to talk about player immersion, both presentational immersion, how the game presents itself to the player in a variety of ways, and interpersonal immersion, how the game reaches out to the player. Excuse me. And this is really the how of video game storytelling. This is the development of video game storytelling is what storytelling is in video games. It's its basic function, which is whereas in player immersion, I'm going to be talking about the details of different ways in which immersion and storytelling can function to the player. So I wanted to ask a discussion question, which is what player immersion is. I mean, it's a pretty broad term. Does anyone have any ideas or personal opinions about how they define it? There's no wrong answer.
Yeah, I have an idea. I have two thoughts on player immersion. The first is there's like an individual immersion where when you're playing as maybe like a more blank slate type character, like I'm thinking Breath of the Wild, or even like Fire Emblem games, where you feel immersed into the world and the setting. So like maybe like a well-crafted setting that's very immersive. Like even Minecraft can do this to you. And then there's like a more story or world-based immersion when you're playing a game with a main character who has a bit of a personality. So like think Xenoblade or basically like I'm thinking like Catherine, for example. Those are games that are like you play a character who has like their own personality and they're probably quite different from you, but you can still feel immersed into the setting, but not because the setting is so powerful, but because it's like the character and the world is really interesting. So like I'd say it's a difference between being immersed into like a VR experience or being immersed into a novel you really, really like.
That's a really good point. You can definitely talk about that as they go on. But yeah, immersion definitely has more than one part, I think. It's up to anyone how they classify those parts. But I think it's important to consider that immersion isn't just one uniform thing. So I'll go on, and again, you can stop me if anyone has any questions. So, like that point just now, it's not exactly the same, but I categorize immersion into presentational, interpersonal. Presentational is more of the VR experience. There's tone and environments, which consists, in my opinion, of art style and music and sound effects, along with some other general aspects. Then there's gameplay and how you can tell stories directly through gameplay. And then there's more of the novel experience. And in my opinion, this all comes down to the credibility of the characters in the world. And when I say credibility, I don't mean you can literally trust them. I mean, it's like suspension of disbelief. You feel like if characters in the game world is credible, you feel like they're real and you're able to look past the part that they're behind the screen. So starting out with presentational immersion, presentational immersion and how it functions with storytelling. So like I just said, tone and environment consist of general aspects, art style, music and sound effects, at least in my opinion. Again, none of this is fact. And I think one of the best possible examples I could give of immersion in general, and definitely at least tone and environment, is The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. So there are a huge number of things I could talk about. I'll just keep it to a few. In Clocktown specifically, the main area of the game. I'll just back up for a second, and for anyone who doesn't know, in Majora's Mask, the moon is coming closer to the Earth, and after 3 days, it's going to crash and destroy everything. And the game functions on a time loop so that at any time you can go back to the first day and play the 3 days over again. So you play these 3 days like over and over again, and you notice the same things happening every time. And these are really immersive because they show the characters in this environment of Clocktown reacting to the moon in very real ways. For example, in the screenshot, I have Mayor Detour, the mayor of Clocktown, and a lot of city officials are arguing with him about whether or not to evacuate the town, and he doesn't make any decision. He's overwhelmed, and everyone's shouting. Another thing is, when the moon draws closer, it visibly draws closer in the sky. It gets bigger and bigger. And on the third day, it even causes earthquakes sporadically, which are a real effect on the screen. The screen shakes. And even most powerfully, one of the characters in Clocktown is a swordsman. He lets Link practice swordsmanship sometimes. He puts on the appearance of being very brave and being unworried about the impending disaster. Whereas in the final hours, if you go into his house and go into his secret room, you find him cowering against the wall. And all of these things, I think, go under general aspects of the tone and the environment. That is, what these characters do sets a consistent tone that's really gloomy and saddening and desperate. And through these actions, the game sets a tone that immerses the player in the story. It provides a context for why they're trying to save the world from the moon, which is that everyone's struggling in their own unique ways. And in general, I just think it's a really great example of setting a tone and an environment. But in addition to all of that, it has art style, music, and gameplay, which I'll talk about next. But first, another general example. Let's hope this works. I'm going to play a YouTube video. Let me know if it doesn't work. This is the introduction to Metroid Prime, and we can break it down afterwards. Okay. Does anyone have any thoughts about how that introduction, what feelings it gave them about what the game was trying to show?
I mean, I will just briefly say that the whole sort of starting off in space and then zooming in first on the rocks that are falling down and then into the spaceship. For the first segment, it definitely gives the space station sort of a aura of mystery about it, just like the overall presentation. And then when Samus sort of comes in, that sort of a different sort of theme plays, which sort of suggests that like she's the hero, she's here to make things better, and you're her, so you're going to make things better by exploring the mysterious spaceship.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the important things you talked about there was the role of sound in setting a tone, which we're going to talk about soon. But in that case, like you said, the sound and music starts off by making everything seem eerie, derelict, and mysterious. And when Samus comes onto the screen, it plays a more heroic theme, like you said. And you also had some good points about the environment and how mysterious and advanced it looked. And I think one of the coolest things here is how Metroid Prime sets all this tone within the first minute and a half. And you know what kind of things you're getting into just from that cutscene. So we talked about the visual aspects, the art style, here, the music, and I think now we should break it down to its component parts. So starting with art style, I want to talk about Kirby's Epic Yarn. And this goes back to the point I made about storytelling not necessarily being complex. Kirby's Epic Yarn does not have a complex story, but it does have storytelling. It has elements that are intended to convey certain feelings about the world and characters to the player. And in this case, those elements come from the art style, which is everything being made out of yarn and fabric and other related materials. And what that does is create a really uplifting, happy feeling. I think it demonstrates that this world is cheerful. It doesn't tell you that in words, but it tells you that with the art style. It's cheerful and colorful. And that's the kind of role an art style can play in immersion. As you're moving through this world, you see the art style and you get the constant feeling that this world is very charming, cheerful, uplifting, all of that because of the art style, and it gets you in the same mood as well. And going on, music and sound effects equally important. We briefly talked about Breath of the Wild earlier. I want to mention it again for its sound effects and its music, I guess. Breath of the Wild has a very unique soundtrack. Sometimes it's criticized for being so sparse, but at the same time, the soundtrack it does have, the light piano and all that, it sets a very strong tone. The atmospheric soundtrack, combined with the environmental sounds, crickets, wind, rain, thunder, all of that. All those sound effects are very prominent because there's so little music. Those sound and music, it sells the idea that this world is in a state of rebirth from disaster 100 years ago. And that's a very important part of the game's storytelling. It's all told environmentally through the sound and music. Another thing I wanted to talk about was Luigi's Mansion. Specifically, I want to talk about how Luigi hums. Actually, I don't remember if he hums in Luigi's Mansion 1 specifically, but in the series he does do it, especially when he's at low health. So when he's in a dark room, there's no music, but he hums along to what the music would be. And when he gets to low health, his humming becomes more warbled and weak. And through the sound effects of his humming, you get the idea that Luigi is very scared. And even when he's weak and at low health, he keeps going because he wants to accomplish his goal. And this is another sound effect that provides immersion through the environment. The player generally feels what Luigi feels, and this isn't conveyed in words. Again, it's conveyed through the sound effect. And one more example I wanted to mention was Metroid Fusion, which I think is interesting even among Metroid games for the creepy atmosphere it sets. Metroid games usually have very atmospheric atmospheres, but Metroid Fusion has a downright creepy atmosphere. And this comes from a variety of things, the music, the sound effects, all of that. But what I want to mention is the SAX. And if you don't know, the SAX is a clone of Samus that tries to hunt her down through the space station she's traveling in. So at certain points in the game, these encounters are scripted. The SAX shows up and you have to hide from it quickly because if it finds you, it's going to kill you. And usually you have to go into a hiding spot and wait while the SAX goes away. But while it's walking around looking for you, the SAX has very distinct footsteps that are prominent because there's not much music during these sections. And those sound effects, like the sound effects in Luigi's Mansion, convey fear, or at least unease. And this is immersive because it provides the context and the goal for a player. In this case, not to be found. The sound effects or the footsteps implicitly tell the player what their goal is. And from what I know, the sound effect of footsteps is a big thing in Resident Evil as well. I haven't played that, so I can't specifically talk to it. So the last category of presentational immersion I want to talk about is storytelling through gameplay. I think Sonic Unleashed provides a good example here. In the introduction cutscene, Sonic goes into a supersonic form and tries to defeat Eggman, but he gets tricked and caught in a trap. And he loses his super form. And that's how the events of the game start. Whereas in the final boss, which I'm not going to show, Sonic goes into a super form again after recovering it over the events of the game. And when you're Super Sonic, you have gameplay differences versus when you're normal Sonic, because primarily Super Sonic can fly. And the feeling of flying around at the speed of light is a huge reward after the whole of the game we weren't able to transform into Super Sonic. And this conveys Sonic's feelings. It conveys an overview of the events of the game where Sonic was defeated at the beginning but worked his way back up. And it emphasizes that your final goal is to defeat the final boss. And again, it doesn't use words, but it conveys purpose and context very well. And as a result, it's immersive. And another example I want to mention was Celeste. Celeste is amazing. Please play it. I couldn't get good images here, but what I wanted to show was that this over here is Celeste's normal sprite. Excuse me, Madeline. The main character is Madeline. This is Madeline's normal sprite with her reddish hair. Whereas here in this screenshot, she has pink hair, and that is because at some point in the game, Madeline accomplishes something important, and as a result gets a permanent power up, and that's represented by her pink hair. Celeste is, I'm simplifying it, but Celeste is about mental health and how to consider it and how to move on from it. And when Madeline makes an important step in this process, she gains the ability to double dash in the air, whereas normally she can only dash once, and the pink hair represents that double dash. So the change in gameplay, which is that she can now double dash, which unlocks a ton of new areas and new possibilities for gameplay. All of that represents the story without words. It conveys what Madeline is feeling, her feelings of power, hope, agency, and it puts that into a gameplay form in an immersive way. So I want to talk about interpersonal player immersion now, which is the novel experience part. This is going to be a bit shorter. So first of all, let's talk about what I call credible characters, but you could also just call characters that seem real, which is how do the characters function outside their role in the game, and how do the characters function within the game's world? So to start off with an example, Professor Layton. Professor Layton is an archaeology professor, but you never actually see him doing archaeology. You never actually see him teaching. He's always solving some crazy mystery, solving puzzles or things like that. However, there's one moment in Professor Layton in the Unwound future where Layton visits his office at the college he works at. And when he visits his office, he encounters one of the students, Miss Stone, and Miss Stone asks Layton if his lecture is canceled again this week because of his adventure, and Layton says, yes, it is canceled. And Miss Stone seems happy about the fact that the lecture is canceled because she's just taking a class for credits, whereas Layton reprimands her and says that she needs to keep working on her dissertation and visit him in office hours every week. And this is really minor. If you look at it in the scope of things, it's just optional dialogue. What makes it significant is the fact that it shows an aspect of Professor Layton's life that you don't see otherwise. He actually is a teacher. He actually does have students. He does teach students. He does actually work as a professor, even if you don't see that. And it provides a dimension of his character that you don't see in the games itself. And because it shows that, it also suggests that there are other dimensions of his character that you don't see. This makes him, I guess what I'd call credible, which is he doesn't seem like a video game character. He seems like a character that happens to be in a video game. And there's a lot that you can't see about him. Sorry, I was drinking water. Another example of credible character, I think, would be Apollo Justice. This person from the Ace Attorney series. The gameplay of the Ace Attorney series is that you get a client to defend as their defense attorney. Apollo Justice is is a defense attorney. You investigate the crime scene, you defend your client in a trial, and then you repeat with another case. You don't see much outside of that. So the gameplay loop for Ace Attorney is that you investigate, go to trial, investigate, and go to trial. It just repeats. But despite that, you still get a lot of information about these characters' lives outside of being lawyers. So just to list off some of it, some of the stuff you get about Apollo Justice in optional conversations. Apollo's good at hula hooping. He watches Doctor Who. He isn't interested in politics. He's made fun of in college for never having had a romantic relationship. He's acrophobic and aquaphobic. He reads manga to procrastinate on his legal work. He's a competitive gamer. And all of these things show that he's not a video game character. Well, he is literally a video game character, but he doesn't seem like one. He seems like a person who happens to be in a video game. There are things that you don't see about him in the scope of the game. And another important thing is that he has a well-documented past. If you're in the Ace Attorney fan base, you know that this is something that's pretty often criticized about Apollo, and there's a separate discussion about how the backstories are handled, so I won't go into that. But what I will say is that this adds to his credibility as a character. Not only are there things you currently can't see about him, there are things that you didn't see about him in the past. He has a life that led up to his role in this video game. He was born, he grew up in a certain place, he had certain friends, and you don't see this about him. But it makes him seem more real and more credible. And as a result, when you have these credible characters, it's a lot easier to give them purpose and significance in the player's mind. And once you have those, you have a bigger connection. This is how the player, this is how the game reaches out to the player by convincing them that these characters are credible. And that in turn creates immersion into the characters and into the story. And the idea of credible game worlds is pretty similar. The question I think we should ask here is the story set in the world of the game, or is the world of the game set in the story? And to illustrate that, I'll show two examples, one good example and one bad example. A good example is Xenoblade Chronicles. So in Xenoblade Chronicles, there are two huge titans, the Bionis and Reconus, and the events of the game take place on top of these two titans. Literally on top of them. These poses here are the poses that the titans are in the game. And the interesting thing here is that before developing the game, Monolith Soft created a physical model of Bionis and Reconus. Before starting any of the development, they created a physical model to figure out what poses these titans should be in so that they could have the most gameplay space possible. So the world came before the game. They're trying to figure out what poses these titans would be in, and the game and the story came afterwards and were set in that world. For example, on the Bionis' head is an ocean. On the Bionis' leg is Galar Plains, if you've ever played Smash. And these places would not have been as they were if the poses of the Titans or other parts of them were plans later on in the development. The story is set on the Titans, not the other way around. To make that a little more clear, we can talk about Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney, Spirit of Justice. So I'm a huge Ace Attorney fan, and I'm a huge Spirit of Justice fan as well. But one thing that's pretty noticeable in Spirit of Justice is that the world was developed as a function of the story. it exists so that the story can exist. The story was planned first. This is Maya. She's a really popular character in the original trilogy of Ace Attorney. And she hadn't returned in the games for a long time. And fans really wanted her back. So one of the things that the developers did when thinking about Spirit of Justice was they prioritized how to get Maya back. And for plot reasons I won't talk about, the way they got Maya back was by creating a whole foreign country, and this gave her a reason to come back. But when you're playing a game, it's pretty clear that it's not an organic country. Let me be clear that I actually like this country, but it's clear that it's not entirely organic. It's there to serve the purposes of the plot, and so indirectly, it's there to serve the purposes of what the developers and the fans wanted. And this can remove immersion when you realize that this is in fact something you're playing. It's not a genuine experience. These aspects of the game were created artificially. It's not something that's credible or that you can easily suspend disbelief at. And so with all that covered, I think that's all I want to talk about for immersion. Does anyone have any questions? I know I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Okay.
I like what you said about how like whether or not the characters could reasonably or like things could reasonably exist maybe independently of the game world, right? And like I think one game I think that suffers, and like earlier I know you mentioned like is there a conflict between good storytelling and interactive gameplay? And I think a great game this is kind of a weird thing to say is I think Fire Emblem Three Houses is a great example of how this can be problematic. So like if you've played Fire Emblem Awakening and Fire Emblem Three Houses, you'll know that the characters in Fire Emblem Three Houses are just better written and they seem to be better. Yet for some reason, like the more I think about it, I like the characters in Awakening better than Three Houses. And I think the reason I like the Awakening characters is that they're worse written. So like in Fire Emblem, since they need the support conversations to work in every single combination at every single time, the characters can never be dynamic. Like they can't change at all. Like the way the game is structured prevents the characters from meaningfully changing or learning anything other than like main characters on prescripted routes. And Three Houses tries to do this by having certain support conversations appear at certain times, but in reality, Three Houses seems to start with really well written and interesting characters who just, as the game progresses, become more and more static and more lifeless. Right? They start out as interesting, but then like you realize they just don't change. They learn nothing. They don't grow at all. So like it's really weird that you have these interesting normal people who just don't change, and it seems like this. It seems like what's going on in the story does not affect them at all. While in Awakening, the characters are just horrible, hilarious caricature like memes, who don't really who are more like character concepts. But then when they don't react to the story at all, like that makes sense. Like Lon Q is not going to change his woman phobia because of a battle. So the characters in Awakening become like way more hilarious and compelling because people like Henry and Tharja are just so absurd and they're like funny. While like watching a character like Raphael make the 10th joke about being really hungry when he should be talking about the fact that we just murdered one of his former classmates, it's just really weird, right? It's even more egregious for characters who should have really crazy opinions like Lysithea or Dorothea, who should have like serious thoughts about what's going on, but instead just has like another support conversation about helping Hilda pack the library. It really like it's totally unimmersive, and I think it's like one of the biggest faults with the story. And the only reason the story is like this is not because they're bad at writing; they're very good at writing. It's because of the way the game is structured. Like if the game wasn't the way it is, then the writing could have been better. So I think it's important to like make sure that the gameplay and the story match. Like I actually really like the idea that I didn't know that in Xenoblade they made the Titans like they made the Titans beforehand with an idea of what the game would. But I don't think it reflects badly. I think it all makes sense. It's reasonable. So I don't know how you'd fix that, right? You'd have to have the story match the gameplay. And in that sense, I'm impressed. Like, I go back and think the Awakening writers, they definitely knew what they were doing. They purposely made the characters as ridiculous as possible to make sure that they didn't get uninteresting as the story progressed.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that about Awakening and Three Houses. There definitely has to be some sort of match between gameplay, and storytelling. The key structure of Ace Attorney is kind of similar in that, in a way, it's slightly holding back what the character writing could be. But I think even when there are these problems, you can slightly make up for it by storytelling in other aspects. Like, it's not a replacement. It's definitely not a replacement for character writing. But like environmental storytelling, musical storytelling, like when leitmotifs are reused and things like that. I think there are other aspects of storytelling that can be used when the storytelling and gameplay don't inherently match, but it is something that has to be considered when making a game. Okay, so I have one more section to talk about, which is player input and player output. And this is the why of storytelling, I think. So once we're assuming that a game is immersive, and at that point, why is immersive storytelling in video games important? And I think I can answer this with a quote that Shigesato Itoi had. Itoi was the developer of the Mother series. Now, to be honest, I don't have the source for this quote. I couldn't find it when I looked, but I'm 90% sure he said it, which is that half of what a player gets out of a game is what they brought to the game themselves. I think that's a really interesting quote, something we don't often think about, which is that the things that a player brings to a game, like their worldview, personality, likes and dislikes, etc., influences what they get out of the game. It's a pretty obvious concept, honestly. We don't talk about it that much. And I want to try to illustrate it here. Okay, so I have another YouTube video demonstration. So this is a song from Professor Layton in the Unwound Future, specifically the credits theme. So if you don't want a musical spoiler, there won't be any spoilers. There won't be any story spoilers. But if you don't want to listen, just turn the volume down until it's over. But I want you to listen to it, and I want you to think about how it makes you feel, like what kind of emotions it conveys. Okay, I think I could listen to that for a long time, but I think that's enough. Does anyone want to say anything about what kinds of feelings they got from the song, like what they think the song is trying to convey? I think the point here is that I don't think either of you have played the game, so you're listening to it without any context.
So yeah, as you mentioned, I have not played the game. I was like at the beginning almost. The clock was like the very beginning. It sounded almost like it sounded a bit strange by itself, but then like as you sort of move on, it sort of builds up to the point where when the full music starts playing, like the clock just fits in perfectly. And I'm not sure, but I'm gonna hazard a guess that the game has something to do with time and maybe fixing time. In which case the song thereby mimics, like it's sort of like broken at the beginning, but like as time goes on, it sort of gets more harmonious and fixed.
Yeah, so you're kind of viewing it optimistically, I guess. It's really interesting what you can get from the game, from the song without having played the game. I chose that specifically because it's kind of niche. I don't think anyone would have played it. But Professor Layton is awesome, especially Unwound Future. So I definitely recommend it if you like puzzle games or games with good stories. But what I want to convey with that example is that a song sounds a lot different if you listen to it in context than if you're just listening to it without context. So that's the credit song, like I said, and I was actually crying when I listened to that for the first time. So when I hear that now, I associate it with a melancholy feeling, mostly sad, nostalgic, but there also is the optimism that was mentioned. So what I want to say here is that it was different when you listen to it without context and if you listen to it to context, with context, because the player brings a lot to what they listen to. They bring their own emotions and feelings. In this case, if you play the game, the emotions and feelings you get come from the game itself, and then that in turn affects your perception of the song. And I think that's an important part of understanding storytelling, which is that a lot of aspects are individual to each player. Once the player is immersed, they get emotions and feelings and themes and other things from the game, which in turn affect how they view the game and what it presents to them. I have one final demonstration, which is another song. This is from Mother 3. No spoilers, but I think the plot is generally well known online anyway. If you don't want to listen to this song though, you should definitely turn the volume down. This is the epilogue theme in a way. It's not actually the epilogue, but it's the last song that plays in the game. And I want to ask the same question, which is, have you played or watched Mother 3 or not? And regardless, how does it make you feel, or what do you think the song is trying to convey? could also listen to that one for a long time. Does anyone have any thoughts?
Sorry. Anyone want to say? Oh, for me, it sounds like a very bright morning, and your mother just prepare some breakfast for you, and yeah, very peaceful and beautiful morning. Yeah.
That's amazing. I never thought about it that way. That's completely possible. Wow.
No, I also thought it kind of felt like a morning too. I agree. That was kind of the vibe I got.
Like, this is really interesting. Have either of you played or watched Mother 3 or know how it ends? I won't say anything.
I know how it begins, but not how it ends.
Okay, so you're listening to this without context. I won't say anything about how the story goes. But that's the first time I've thought about it as a new warning, but it definitely works. The thing I want to demonstrate here is that when you listen to it with context, even when you know exactly how the story goes, different people have different interpretations. I've heard several different interpretations from other fans, and now I've heard a new interpretation from people who are listening to it without context, which is really cool. So people who've played the game generally listen to it as melancholy or nostalgic or hopeful or optimistic, which I guess goes along with the new morning thing, or a combination of those, or something else. I think what I want to say here is that while it has a wider range of emotions, possible emotions, I think, than time travel did. Not that time travel is bad at all, definitely not. But Mother Series is a more ambiguous game with more ambiguous storytelling, and depending on what kind of person you are, your worldview, how you view the characters, what you like in games, what you don't like, what beliefs you have, religious, political, otherwise, you can hear that, you can listen to that song as different. You might hear it more hopeful than someone else, or more melancholy, more optimistic. And I'm highlighting this because it's an important thing to consider. Once you have a player immersed in a game, what happens next is up to both the player and the game. The game can send different emotions or feelings to the player, but it's only the player and their past and their experiences that determines what feelings they actually get. And as a result, there are some games that can connect really personally to people, and Mega Man Star Force is a game like that for me. As you can see from the screenshot, this is a Mega Man RPG, but it's a lot more emotional and complex than you would expect from Mega Man RPG if you were judging it based on the classic platformer series. But this game is about the boy in that picture is named Geo Stellar. He's a 5th grader who's struggling with depression after his father disappeared a year ago. And this is a specific set of experiences. I don't have this father disappearing part, but I do have more experience with the mental health part, and that connected and resonated with me. I was already immersed in the game because of how believable, realistic, credible the characters were, along with the world, along with the use of music and sprites. You can see here that Gio is frowning in his mugshot here, whereas a cool detail is that later on in the game, that frown turns into a smile as he learns how to be happier. But this is an example of a game, in a way, choosing a demographic to reach out to. Another example is Celeste, which I talked about earlier briefly. That one is more about mental health in a specific way. Anxiety attacks and anxiety, panic attacks, depression, social pressure, everything like that. Whereas this is mental health in a more general way. And because of this choice, the game reaches out to a certain set of players, and those players use their experiences to connect with the game. Again, this is none of this is earth-shattering. I think it's important to verbalize it, so that we can think about it more easily. And one more thing, I have to talk about Paper Mario sometime. This is another example, I think, of the effect of when a game means a lot to a person. So, in case anyone doesn't know, the Paper Mario series has been pretty controversial recently. The first 3 games are considered amazing by the general community. Of course, there are exceptions. Whereas starting with the 4th game, Sticker Star, the story was simplified, the characters were simplified, and a lot of people felt that it wasn't the Paper Mario they were used to. The Paper Mario they were used to is exemplified by the 1,000-Year Door on the left here. It's considered a very good game. I agree. This is the world map of 1,000-Year Door. You can see it's very connected. Everything is clear in relation to everything else. You know, like where this floating island is in relation to this castle. And the world is connected. You walk around the whole world on foot. Whereas here, this is Sticker Star, the 4th game, and the one that started all the problems. The problems that they're perceived to be. Here, there's a world map. The connected world is gone. You don't walk around the world on foot. You just go to the world map and press left or up or right or down, and you go to the next level. The world is divided into levels, and there's a goal at the end. So the backlash could definitely be caused by nostalgia in some way. That's definitely part of it for certain players, but I think another important part is that old Paper Mario means a lot to people, and when new Paper Mario didn't deliver on that, they were really upset. I think this is an interesting example of people going into a game with their experiences of a past game, and in this way, a past game influences their perception of another game. So it's not just worldview or beliefs, likes and dislikes, things like that, that affect what people get out of a game, but also the other games they've played, and the stories in those games. Because I should mention that the 1,000-Year Door and Super Paper Mario have very deep and interesting stories and characters, whereas in Sticker Star, it was very simplified to the level of a 2D Mario platformer. So in this way, it's important to think about when you're making a game how to be immersive, and once a game is immersive, you need to think about if you're targeting it towards a specific demographic with the storytelling, or how, and also you have to think about how a player's experiences might change their perception of the game, as with old Super Mario fans playing Sticker Star. And in general, this whole idea of player input and player output, what a player puts into a game, their experiences, what a player gets out of a game from the storytelling, this is pretty much why storytelling exists. The fundamental reason is that it provides context, purpose, and significance to a game, so that it's not just a set of pixels, but as we move farther along, the more complex reason is that people put in their own experiences to the story, and they get other things out based on their own experiences. And I think that can be a useful framework to think about. So to summarize one more time, there's the what of storytelling in video games. There's the how it functions, presentational, interpersonal, and then there's the why, which happens after the immersion. Why, on a more complex level, the storytelling exists. How can it be? Why is it so effective in certain cases and not in others? And why does it have different effects in different cases? And that is finally all I have. So does anyone have any questions, finally, now that it's over? Anything at all? And it's also completely fine if you don't have any questions, because we already answered a lot of questions.
What do you think about visual novels?
I love visual novels. Do you know this character?
I know, I don't. I don't know. I know like nothing about visual novels.
This is Trucy, a character from Ace Attorney, which is a visual novel. I should preface this by saying that I don't have that much experience with visual novels. I played Ace Attorney and I played Professor Layton, but of what I've played, I love them. This brings up the question of interactivity versus storytelling again. Visual novels are, depending on which visual novel it is, I think Ace Attorney and Professor Layton are generally on the more interactive side. But it brings up the question of, does the decreased interactivity of visual novels lead to more opportunity for storytelling? I think it does, in a way, but there's also all the other categories of storytelling to think about, the environment and tone. I was thinking about playing music from Apollo Justice Ace Attorney for this presentation because that game sets an amazing tone. I didn't end up doing it to make this presentation a little shorter. There's, like I said, music and sound effects, art style. Art style is also important. To talk about Apollo Justice Ace Attorney again, it has a unique color palette in the Ace Attorney series. So there's the original trilogy of Ace Attorney, and Apollo Justice comes after it, after a 7-year gap. And the art style and music, the dark color palette that's used, and the atmospheric, mysterious, or sometimes foreboding music. It all differentiates it from the previous trilogy. It shows that it's the same series, but a lot of things have happened and things aren't the same. And it does that without using words. Without using words is a pretty common theme that's come up today, I guess. But anyway, that wasn't very coherent. It's all just to say that I like visual novels. They are less interactive than other forms of games, and I think that does benefit them in storytelling, at least in the traditional sense, because there's more opportunity for dialogue, but they have just the same other categories of storytelling as other more interactive games do, like music, sound, environment, tone, all of that. Okay. If there aren't any other questions, I think we can end it.
Okay. I have sorry. That reminds me one thing. Recently, there is a game called The Last of Us 2. Have you heard that?
I have heard it. I haven't played it.
Oh yeah, that because that game caused a lot of controversy about. Just wonder if when you just look at those news, do you think it's a story problem or a storytelling problem to for causing that such a lot of controversies?
I think from what I remember, I think it's more of a story problem rather than a storytelling problem. But more broadly, I think it's less involved with the game itself. Well, actually, let me just say I'm not very informed on this, but from my perspective, there's a lot of political ideas behind this. And I think, I don't know how exactly those political ideas played into the story or if there were any political ideas at all. I know the general perception was that it was a political choice to do what they did. But yeah, I think the controversy comes from a specific event in the story. So I think that would be more of a story or character problem rather than an immersion problem. But there is an immersion problem in the sense that a lot of people don't like this story event, so that they think it's forced from, they consider it forced from external political beliefs, and as a result, the characters and world seem less credible. So I think there is a relationship between story and storytelling.
It reminds me a lot of like, so when Metal Gear Solid 2 came out in like what, the early 2000s, people thought it would be like a game where you play a Solid Snake the whole time, but like the trick is that like about 1/4 through the game you switch characters and you just play as Raiden for the entire rest of the game. And people didn't like that because they thought they felt like cheated because they thought this was me about, you know, I'm gonna play a snake and be all cool. So it actually reminds me a lot of that, because when like people when they saw The Last of Us 2, they wanted to like play, like they thought they were going to be playing as Dick Joel the whole game, right? So like it does feel like, I think it's very dangerous to like, if you want to change up your main character like that, you have to do it right. And I can see why people didn't like it, because they felt like they were like false advertising. Because certainly when Metal Gear Solid 2 was advertised, they did not advertise it as a Raiden game. They should have showed the gameplay of Snake. So yeah, I can see why people got upset, and I definitely think it's an issue of like trying to justify. You have to justify, like you have to go out of your way to your player to justify why you should play as this character and why this character is worthy of being the new main character. And I think that's definitely one of the weaknesses of the story.
Changing the main character is a topic I have a lot of experience with, because that's the whole thing about Apollo Justice Ace Attorney. In the original, I'm talking about Ace Attorney a lot. That's only because I love it so much. In the original trilogy, he plays Phoenix Wright. but after the 7-year gap, you don't play as Phoenix anymore for certain reasons. You play as Apollo, who's a completely new character, and that caused a lot of backlash. But in my opinion, the game did justify it very well. First of all, it was advertised from the beginning as an Apollo game, not a Phoenix game. It's in the title, and you know it from the start. But people go into the game generally and they're wondering if Apollo is a worthy successor to Phoenix, and that generally seems to affect your judgment a lot. And it's pretty often that people view him negatively, not entirely, but mostly because he's not Phoenix. So I think that while it's very tricky to change up a main character partway through a game without advertising it, there are also problems if you change it up front, because people bring their own experiences to the game as a past character, and they feel like the game they're playing isn't the game they used to play, and that takes them out of the game. So there are problems both ways.
Yeah, and I think just in general that when games have a precedent of like previous sequels, previous literature, things like that, it gets much harder to change things, especially things that are seen in some senses as like, oh, maybe this is like a step down, or like, oh, one of our favorite aspects is gone. I think one example of this that was done sort of well is in Doom Eternal. From Doom 2016 to Doom Eternal, they changed a lot of the power-ups to be more colorful and more game-like, and everyone was like, oh, this is going to ruin our immersion. But when it actually came time for like the game to actually be played out, it turned out, because they had changed so many other systems as well, and they had like shown it off early enough, that it seemed to be sort of like everyone sort of agreed that that was the right choice. I think in like things where like I think Doki Doki Literature Club is like, in that case, there's a twist involved, but you know from the very beginning that something is up when they display the warning, hey, there's going to be some psychological elements in this game, something like that. If they didn't display a warning like that, I do not think Doki Doki Literature Club would be as well received for what it does as it is.
Definitely. There are definitely benefits to knowing something up front, especially if it could be disturbing or otherwise harmful. The thing you said about Doom Eternal reminded me of Wind Waker. I mean, I wasn't there when it was released, but from what I know, people were very upset about the cel-shaded art style, and it looked childish and too game-like, I guess, and not mature or real enough. Whereas over time, people warmed up to it. I don't know if they warmed up to it by release or after release, but I guess when you're thinking about how people view games, you also have to think about what happens a long time after the game is released. Because I know pretty much no one complains about Wind Waker's art style today, and it's part of the environment that Wind Waker creates, and it's part of the immersion.
I mean, yeah, I agree. Like the Wind Waker controversy was dumb in hindsight, right? Like everyone loves it today. There's no such thing as people who don't like Wind Waker because of its art style. So that kind of died, right? So I guess it's about execution, like how well you do it. Like then now the question is, if for Last of Us 2 had they made, if the switch off had been like even more excellent, would people have not gotten mad because of the political reasons? I think that's like probably why there was so much rage at the game, which is, in my opinion, kind of ridiculous. But I don't know. I think people care a lot about stories, right? Like if they're good. Like the reason Super Paper Mario is like relevant today is not because of its gameplay, it's entirely because of the story, right? Like that game has like been able to meet the quality standards of its predecessors among some people in the community because of its excellent story, right?
That's entirely true. Super Paper Mario is my favorite game in the series. The gameplay is fine. It's pretty good, but it's not incredible or anything. It's just a platformer with RPG elements, and it's the story that sets it apart, like you said.
Story's like out of control. It's incredible. I have no idea how Nintendo made a story that creative. Like I'm just impressed.
Yeah, definitely. And since we're talking about environment and tone and how that affects storytelling, I should mention that it's kind of similar to Majora's Mask in that there's a void in the sky, which is a dimensional rift that gets bigger and bigger as you go through the game. And once it gets big enough, the problem is that it's going to absorb everything and destroy the entire multiverse. And as you go through the plot, it gets bigger, and that's storytelling through the environment that constantly reminds you of your purpose and reminds you of the consequences if you fail. And I think that's great for immersion. There are a lot of other things I could talk about too. That Super Super Mario could probably be its own presentation.
All right, I think that's it. So thank you so much, Ben, for this excellent.
Yep, thank you.
Here, I'm gonna use the clap emoji. Hold on a second. There we go. You guys can clap, react.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out. There we go.
Zoom is really awkward. Yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And for those of you watching on the internet, definitely feel free to subscribe, like, drop some comments. Maybe we can have a discussion in the comments if you want. But yeah, thank you so much for this presentation, and we learned a lot. So
Thank you.
bye.